Hello, everyone, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you all. I'd like to welcome you to this webinar, and I'd like to start off by introducing Melanie Fillet, who is the CEO and co-founder of Speckit, which is a company doing some incredible things in the digital enablement space. Speckit services real-time training and enablement resources directly within the tools like Salesforce, Outreach, LinkedIn that your teams are using to drive rep productivity and help you close deals faster.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Jack. Great to meet you all. Super excited to be here today. As you mentioned, I'm one of the co-founders and CEO at Speckit. Speckit was really started more as a passion project as I was looking for a solution to my own challenges, leading enablement and ops at my last company, looking at every solution under the sun in the enablement stack, looking at LMSs, knowledge management platforms, digital adoption platforms, and ultimately thinking that there was a need for a newer, more modern, just-in-time way of doing things. And super excited to give you guys a little bit more background on Speckit. But before I do that, I'd love to introduce my co-host here, Whitney, who is the Senior Director of Enablement at Outreach. Whitney, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and why you call yourself the enablement enthusiast.
I know, we share that tagline. All right. Hi, everyone. Yes, as Mel said, Senior Director of Enablement at Outreach. And I started my career in sales and found very quickly that I loved training my sales teams. And so I relentlessly pursued that as a career. I did consulting for small to mid-sized companies. And then I ended up working in a center of excellence at Baker Hughes, which is now a part of GE, rolling out their sales academy, rolling out methodology across 7,000 sellers worldwide, living out of a suitcase, doing that life for a bit. And that's where I learned a lot of best practices that I've carried with me throughout my career. And after that, I moved into the SaaS space and worked in startups and helped teams double in size, double in revenue by using those best practices and growing the enablement function in those spaces. But now I am so excited. I joined Outreach this past summer, and our enablement team spans the entire go-to-market team. So from SDRs to AEs to customer success, anyone who touches the customer journey is really who we're focused on. But yeah, I moved in the middle of a pandemic from New York to Seattle, and we're just growing so incredibly fast. We're hiring in roles all across the business. It's just an exciting time to be at Outreach, and I'm loving this meta mission of enabling revenue teams that in turn enable other revenue teams. So it's definitely a pinnacle moment in my career, and super excited to be here today and talk rep productivity strategy with you, Mel.
Awesome, super excited as well. And I can't wait to dive in, and starting with your experience working at scaling startups, because that's a whole experience of its own. But as I was reflecting right before going into this session, given that most of the audience for the Sales Enablement Collective is based out of Europe and we don't have as big of a presence there, I thought I'd kick us off with just a quick overview of what digital enablement is and give you guys a little bit more context so that as we kind of dive, and we're gonna go strategic, but we're also gonna go tactical because the two of us probably can't help it when it comes to these discussions. You guys have a somewhat of a visual when it comes to, what is just-in-time learning? What is contextual learning? So I'm just gonna spend the first 5 minutes here giving you guys a super fast overview of Speckit and what digital enablement is before we dive into all of the exciting content that Whitney and I have planned. So with that, and can you see my slide, Whitney?
Yes.
Awesome. So for those of you that haven't heard of Speckit, we are a digital enablement platform, that's really all about helping employees learn faster, both during onboarding as well as in their day-to-day, and also work smarter, meaning work more efficiently, work more productively with information at their fingertips. We've been around for about 3 years. We just recently announced our Series A fundraise, raised $12 million, and our focus is really on ease of use for both enablement teams, given that my background is the person actually writing all the content, creating all the training, delivering all the training, and making people like my job and Whitney's job easier, hopefully, but then also making the access to information easier for employees. And we serve customers across all different types of technology companies, as well as more established organizations like Southwest Airlines, JLL, that are either growing really fast and have a lot of onboarding needs, or they're going through digital transformations, introducing new technologies like Salesforce or CPQ or Workday, and really looking to kind of modernize their approach to rolling out these technologies at the same time. And really, the reason why Speckit came to be is I was working at a fast-growing company as well. And as I was looking at our employee base and the demands that were placed on them, there were more workflows than ever, right? We had 8 different tools that they had to use. And if you just took Salesforce alone, there was like 5 objects, hundreds of fields. Like there was just so much complexity in what we expected as a bare minimum for employees just to do their job to know when it came to our tool systems and processes. And on top of that, unlike 10 years ago where there was maybe one competitor in our space, and we were a real estate crowdfunding platform, and still there were 6 competitors in our space, and our sales reps needed to know how to position against and how to find all that information. So the amount of just sheer knowledge that we expected reps to know about our products, our services, et cetera, was significant. And lastly, we were growing at the speed of light, launching new business lines, forming new functions, you name it, and change was constant across our systems, across our tools, across our enablement. And we just didn't have really an effective way of doing that because we were really using this hodgepodge of solutions. We were using Slack and email to communicate updates. We had our knowledge spread across knowledge management platforms as well as Google Drive and spreadsheets. We had, learning spread across PowerPoint and LMSs. And then we had, we didn't have tool training, but that was something that I evaluated. And so my job became, and I was responsible for all of our employee-facing technology. So the same teams that Whitney was just discussing, I was responsible for all the technology. So I managed Salesforce, I managed Outreach, I managed those tools, and I was responsible for both the adoption of those tools and helping them, make sure that our employees knew how to use them, but also how do I just make sure employees know what they need to know when they're in their tools, right? If a customer reaches out to someone via Outreach and asks a question, how can we readily surface that answer to them? And after spending about a year looking at the enablement stack, looking at, like I mentioned, LMS platforms, knowledge management platforms, digital adoption platforms, I concluded that what all these tools had in common was a foundation of content. But, if you could search it, it was a knowledge base. If you could assess on it, it was an LMS. If you could have it contextual as a digital adoption platform, I'm like, I feel like there's an easier way to address this challenge. And ultimately, as I took the step back, I really envisioned a world where employees love to learn again. And that's something that we'll talk a little bit, as we get into enablement strategies with me. But, I really think as children and as humans, people love to learn, right? Like as a child, I loved learning new scientific facts. And, if I watch a documentary nowadays where I learn something, you won't hear me shut up about it for weeks because I'm just so excited. But the reality is when you say the words change management or you need to attend this training in the workplace, you're met with a little bit of apprehension or eye rolls. And I really envision a future where we can start, bringing that love of learning back to the workplace and really helping employees effortlessly master their roles, whether that's a job transition, whether that's a promotion or whatnot, with learning that seamlessly accompanies them in that journey. And that's what we set out to do. We really combined the features that are traditionally associated with adoption, which is, in-app training and embedded training, with enablement, which is, where's our playbook located? How do we surface that right where the employee needs it in LinkedIn and really create this unified experience for them? And so what we call digital enablement is really this all-in-one companion that both accelerates proficiency when it comes to learning your different tools and workflows so that when you're logging into Outreach or Salesforce or LinkedIn for the first time, you can be guided through the processes you need, but then also have instant access to the resources that you need for that on-the-job knowledge right where you need it. And then have change management functionality so that, and Whitney had a good example a couple of weeks ago, when they launched their new stages in Salesforce, they were able to use our Spotlight functionality so that the next time that employee logged in, they had the refresher right there of, hey, heads up, our stages have changed, here's what you need to know, and really have that ongoing reinforcement. And really where we're going is taking inspiration from more traditional learning solutions and incorporating ways to kind of assess for those kinds of changes as they go about their day-to-day workflow. So hopefully that was helpful from a digital enablement standpoint. That's what we do. I'll show just 2 quick examples before jumping in, and we'll get straight back to the content. So Whitney, can you see my screen here?
Yes.
Awesome. So Speckit lives wherever your employees live, whether that's in Salesforce, whether that's in LinkedIn, or any other application. And there's a couple different ways you can access Speckit. One is using our sidebar here. You'll see that with our Salesforce integration, if a rep is in Salesforce and they're on an opportunity, you can see key resources such as maybe here are the steps to qualifying a meeting right there, right where they need to access them. They can also access all of our topics, which is folders of information for easy access, like your SDR playbook, or they can search for an answer like, hey, how do I log a call at their fingertips? Again, the idea is that they're staying in the flow, they're not having to leave what they're doing, and all that training that would be stored in a PowerPoint or Google Doc or you name it can be accessible right there for that just-in-time answer. You'll also see that you can embed training directly in the user interface. So for example, let's say, going back to the stage example, someone was looking at stage 1, you can actually have your playbook right there with links to key resources. So for example, if I'm in stage 1, I might need to access my discovery questions, right? So again, it's all about taking that content that you have and just making it more readily available to your employees right there, where you can get reactions and feedback if it's helpful, and you can add all sorts of content. And this is all done automatically using our Salesforce integration. And just to contextualize it again, I've mentioned it works across applications. If you're in LinkedIn, for example, you can embed your persona card so that that SDR coming out of training, coming out of that boot camp can easily access, hey, I'm looking at a VP of Sales Productivity here. Here's how to tailor the message. We have John Barrow's training in Speckit where you can view how to tailor that message there, or you can have links to Gong videos, etc. So again, it's all about how easy is it for an employee to access that information right there. So hopefully that helps. Just wanted to give a quick overview before we jump in. So awesome. So enough about Speckit. Let's dive into your experience, Whitney. So you talked about working at high growth startups. Like, what has been the biggest challenge of working in these constantly changing environments for you as an enablement professional, and how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, the fact that I've done it a few times now makes me feel like I'm able to see some trends. And I think one of the biggest challenges that I face on a repeated level, and that I hear from industry peers even, is that we've got this concept of what enablement should look like. And enablement pros are super organized. They can visualize this like end-to-end process. And I've done this, and I'm sure that many people on this call have done this before, but like the first thing you do when you typically go to work at a startup is you evaluate the onboarding program, you collaborate with like a mix of successful reps and managers, and you create this like checklist of all the things a rep should know. And you put it in order potentially around like prioritizing what gets someone customer ready or ready to engage with a customer. And I've come to realize that we crave things to be nice and neat, but life isn't linear and learning isn't either. And so the example that comes to mind that I know I've messed up multiple times is around like late stage processes. I remember in a previous role, I had like early tech stack training because I wanted everyone to get logged in. I wanted everyone to know what was in the incredible tech stacks that we offered. But reps would learn how to build a quote in like week 3 because we had to accommodate scale. And what I mean by that is like we had transactional sellers and consultative like enterprise sellers going through the same program, but their role requirements are completely different. And so that transactional seller may use those skills the next day, but in the enterprise space, it could be months before they need to execute from that training. And so I found us having to do a lot of double work. And so that was one of the biggest challenges that I've seen is like, we try to fit it into this linear path and we end up pleasing no one instead of pleasing everyone.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a really good point, that example of a quote, which is the timing of training and being able to contextualize it. Because to your point, you know, on that 3rd week, if someone's going over the quoting process, like it might, you know, when they go to do it 6 months later, they might have they might be able to remember, okay, it's in CPQ and like I started from the opportunity, but the details of that process, like based on science, can't expect people to remember it because that's just scientifically, unproven. But also, a lot of remembering to do a process is learning by doing, right? And being able to like go about and do it that first time. So yeah, I think that's something that a lot of teams have a hard time addressing. And with that, we talk about the different like shifting roles of enablement today. How do you deal with those different competing priorities, right? When it comes to like, how do you prioritize revamping like your onboarding program because you guys have new products versus training your existing teams on your new pricing and packaging versus all the changes that are happening across your systems? Like, how do you think about these competing priorities for your enablement team? Like, have you addressed that via structure of your team? Like, talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, totally. I think, I think you mentioned it earlier, but like the only constant is change when you're in one of these hyper growth startups. And you'll always have to find this balance between proactive and reactive requests. And so the way that I've done it and the way that my teams have done it is around like rigorous prioritization. And so the good thing is I report directly to our CRO. So I've got a seat at the table when we're going through our strategic planning process. And so that helps me have anchors with strategic initiatives with the top level execs to know what's going to have the biggest impact. And so my team we've got like these templates around associated project plans that are based on the prioritization of like effort and impact. And so we actually use the Kirkpatrick model as the basis. I know you're talking about like the science of learning, and this is one of those methodologies that was created, I think, back even in the 60s, but it's sort of been my magic bullet when transitioning from like L&D best practices into the enablement space. And you normally have like a mixed bag of people who join this space. It's either from an L&D background, like training side, or from sales. And so if it's not too much, I'd love to go into a little detail around like what that means for me.
Yes, please, especially because that's actually something I talk about a lot, which is back in the day, to join a learning department in organizations, like you had to have a master's or even PhD in learning design, instructional design that you went to university for, right? And if we think about today, most sales enablement professionals, you mentioned, come back from a background in sales. Like I came from a background in ops, right? And I think a lot of the times when training fails, it's not because the content wasn't there, it's because the delivery mechanisms fail, because we tried to pack too much or we didn't spread things out effectively. And so I think the science of learning, and for enablement professionals out there, if you fell into this role kind of accidentally, studying the science of learning on your own so that you can get that knowledge that you might not have actually studied can be hugely beneficial on your career. So let's hear from you firsthand. Super interested.
Yeah, totally. And it's not just around the science of learning, but it's also around like this emotional reaction. Like when you're working with sales leaders, they get driven by what's in the moment. And so you have to have data to really back up, why you're looking to prioritize something. And so the Kirkpatrick model has been really helpful in this exercise for my team. And so when we look at the prioritization, we talk about what are we going to be able to measure at the end of this, and how does this align to the strategic initiative? So there are 4 levels of Kirkpatrick. The first is around reaction. And so when you're doing any sort of training initiative, understanding like, did the team enjoy it and are they motivated to apply? Like, is there that motivation to actually go and implement the change that you're describing? The second level is around knowledge and retention. And so it's, did they actually learn what you wanted them to learn? Or are there gaps where maybe we need to explain it in a different way to help it land? The third and the hardest is around behavior change itself. And that takes a long time. There's loads of reinforcement that's involved, lots of coaching involved. Like that is where enablement becomes a team sport. And everyone sort of has to be rowing in the same motion to be able to execute on the behavior change and really drive it to the finish line. So that in level 4, you can actually look at it and say, I've had an impact on the business. And I find that that's a challenge for a lot of people to really draw that correlation to ARR or like the impact that you're bringing from enablement to the business from a training event. And so this model has been super helpful for us in ensuring that we have all the right pieces of our reinforcement plans, as well as know how to talk about the impact that we're making.
Love that. So many thoughts on that. So the first one, I'll say them both so I don't forget. Team, champions, and then data in learning. So let's talk first about that third piece where we talked about, really driving that behavioral change. And I think where a lot of teams have a hard time is really that part there, which is you deliver the training, like you got feedback, but people aren't actually changing. And I think, where I saw that fail firsthand is that, for example, when our company rolled out Salesforce, my previous employer, it was an IT-led initiative. So did they deliver training? Yes. Was it to Whitney's standard? Debatable. But at the end of the day, like what we didn't have buy-in was from like the actual frontline managers and from like the core users. And so I talk about all the time when I ended up taking over Salesforce, re-architecting and re-implementing it, I sat down with our end users, and I selected both kind of the most vocal AEs on our team, so the ones that have the highest influence in terms of getting other people to follow, as well as our top performers that people naturally look up to. And I really wanted to get both of them on board, both of those categories of users, and in each case it was about 3 or 4. So because I knew that if I built something that I knew that they would buy into, then that ripple effect, that osmosis effect would happen without me having to be the constant driver of it. So talk to me a little bit about how you've addressed that in the past. When have you done that really well? When are times that you wish you had done things differently to really get that, group buy-in when it came to rolling out whatever training you were doing?
Yeah, totally. There's not a rule book for enablement yet. So a lot of this learning for me has been trial by fire, and I've done it wrong and had to learn from it. And that's sort of how these templates that I'm describing got created as project plans. And so now it's like my risk mitigation. It's like, have I checked with the rep persona? Have I checked with frontline managers? Are top leaders in alignment with this initiative? And then even in addition to that, looking at how does it impact our cross-functional partners? Because especially in the startup space, looking upstream and downstream at the impact of changes that you're making is so critical, or else you're going to have to do rework later. And so learned that through initiatives that I've launched and had to do that double work on. So going back now, before we even launch a project, we make sure that those cross-functional partners are involved, and we look at it through the lens of the customer experience too. So I would just add a few more personas to what you described to say, like, make sure when you're kicking off a project that you're considering all those different angles and perspectives before just jumping in and satisfying a request, because it's important to make sure that it's successful.
Yeah, and I love your emphasis on like having those templates, and I think that really comes back to having process. I think, the most effective enablement and training programs out there have a foundation of process and a strong structure when it comes to things like naming conventions, organizational structure around your content and where things are stored, but also process on like what are the best tools and what are the best ways of communicating this training, which we'll get into as well. Awesome. And just touching on the piece around data, like I actually think that that's one of the biggest opportunities as a technology vendor in this broad space, because if you look at pretty much like every other kind of tool designed to drive productivity or revenue for organizations, take for example sales engagement platform like Outreach, right? The data that you get is ultimately, other than like the actual productivity you get from being able to put a lot of people in a sequence, it's the visibility and understanding that you get around like reply rates and engagement rates on a given sequence that help you actually iterate on your messaging, right? So it's very much a data-driven platform. If you look at a CMS platform like a HighSpot or Seismic, right, the benefit and value that you get is that you know what content is driving, engagement from your customers and what's impacting ARR. Now, when you look at learning, and this is where I spend the majority of my brain space, it's very, very behind when it comes to data, right? Because there is no easy way to correlate. Like, so let's take webinars and stuff out of the way. Let's just think about it from like a traditional like LMS content and course. Does someone getting an A or 100% on your competitor quiz on week 1 actually correlate to their success winning competitive deals the first time they encounter that competitor on week 5 or on week 8, right? The reality is it's hard. And most of us take a very reactive approach, which is like, hey, if you take the time to analyze and you see that the win-loss rate, for example, against competitors is low, oh, we need to do training on this, right? And really where I see the future of learning, and we'll talk more about this as well, is like, I think there's a big opportunity to leverage the data and insights we have access to proactively actually guide what learning is needed, what learning is effective, what learning is driving revenue, and really diving into, how that can improve the overall learning experience.
Totally. And that's sort of what I was getting at when I said, like, sometimes it's easy to follow the emotional reaction, which is like, let's just dive into the competitive training. But in reality, like, you've got to look at and assess a variety of leading indicators, lagging indicators. And in startup space, like my conference joke is there's also lacking indicators, meaning there's things that we aren't measuring right now that we need to put measures in place to start to establish baselines so that we can have that type of insight you're describing. The biggest challenge I find in enablement, and from talking to my peers too, is like all of our data is disparate. So we have to work with like sophisticated BI teams to put together metrics packs that pulls from all those systems that you just described to tell a comprehensive picture. So yeah, that's a big one.
Love it. Well, going back to, enablement pulling you into a lot of different directions. If we think about enablement beyond onboarding, how do you think about like reinforcement of processes, of new sales methodologies, of things like pricing and packaging? Like, talk to me a little bit about like what your view is on, kind of the onboarding, but then like once someone's onboarding, what is that journey beyond that, into how you keep that continuous learning train going?
Yeah, there's a few things that come to mind here. The first is like, my team is set up as internal consultants to the business. And then there's like a separation for how we've built a team where we've got agents of scale that are making sure that, all of our systems across the revenue team are operating in a consistent fashion and that we're not having these unique nuanced by team. And then we've got agents of change that are just trying to keep up with the rapid pace of innovation at Outreach, which we're growing so fast, we're creating new product all the time. And so making sure that the teams are in the loop there. So split by scale and split by change is something that we've been doing to help make sure that we are not just doing it once for the existing team, but that we've got a concept to help reinforce it and sustain it. So it's like a launch, reinforce, sustain is sort of the high level of what we're trying to do. When you talk about that entire employee journey, this is something I'm super passionate about because you're absolutely right. If you look more at like the outcomes-based enablement, not necessarily the deliverables, like saying onboarding, but saying decreasing ramp time and owning that strategy, you've got what sets you up for a really great measurement effect for the long term. And so I call it like employee lifetime value is what I've worked with at other organizations. It's similar to like if you're working with sales leaders, they talk about customer lifetime value all the time. For us, our internal customers are our revenue teams. And so we like to treat them with that similar fashion so we can measure in similar ways. So looking at, can we decrease their ramp time and how much value that brings back to the business? How much do they grow over time? Because when you're in a startup, that institutional knowledge is crucial. So setting up like measures to make them not only effective in their role, but also to help them get ready for their next role is really important. And then finally, like how long do they stay with the business? Are they feeling like they're being developed? Are they feeling like they're growing? Are we making them successful? And so that really is that long term of employee lifetime value that we like to consider to make sure that, you know, we're not just considering onboarding and short term initiatives, but we're looking at that full picture.
I love that. Yeah, I always talk to our customers about the fact that your customer experience starts with your employee experience, right? When it comes to how easy of a job you make it for them to be successful, because that resonates in their communication style to your customers, their reactions to your customers, and ultimately the quality of deliverables, whether that's sales, whether that's support, or you name it. Yeah, I think that's a really good way of looking at it. And I think, you know, people have been talking about the pandemic and how it's going to change work. And I think, you know, we could go all day long and we'll talk a little bit about it around, you know, is it going to continue remote? Are we going to have dispersed? Like for us, we were already dispersed where we have a couple different offices, but we're going to make, you know, if you're in the location of the office, we're going to have certain requirements, but if you're remote, you know, so we're going through that discussion right now. But one thing that I've been thinking about a lot and talking about a lot is I think, you know, a big shift that's going to happen is that a lot of individuals, and I've seen it firsthand with people reaching out to me looking for connections for jobs that have been at the same company for 10, 15 years, or sometimes less, but that didn't really have job access elsewhere because the kinds of roles that they were looking for didn't have that virtual or remote opportunity. They're now looking at the multitude of roles out there that they can apply for. And so I think, you know, that emphasis on retention is going to become a much more important, you know, area of enablement for organizations because the risk of jumping ship is much, much higher than it used to be in a virtual world where that same role that you have, there's hundreds of companies out there located virtually anywhere in the world that you can apply to. So I think retention is going to be a huge piece. And I think onboarding in terms of attracting top hires too, a lot of companies aren't going to get the onboarding piece right. Like that's the reality, right? We had one of our reps who came over from one of our customers who said, you know, I felt more comfortable 2 weeks at Speckit than I did 4 months in at my previous employer, right? And the thing is, once you've gone through what a strong onboarding experience looks like at a company where you feel like you have tools at your disposal that you need to be successful in a work from home environment, if you try switching jobs and now you're left on your own and having to communicate via Slack and email to get answers to your questions, you can be the most successful rep in the world. You're not going to want to have to endure that when you know that there's other companies out there that are placing a bigger emphasis on how they're enabling employees, how they're making you successful. And so I think, you know, there's a couple shifts that are going to happen. I think from an enablement standpoint, you know, really thinking about the readiness aspect as well as retention piece is going to become a huge component. And I think, you know, as part of your onboarding process, especially as a sales rep, one of the questions you're going to start asking is like, talk to me about what tools I'm going to have access to. If I'm going to work from home, how am I going to be able to do my job? Talk to me about how I'm going to get trained, because they're going to go through a couple of those experiences that aren't as successful. And that's going to become a huge part of like how they decide what employer they go work for and who has the best programs out there.
Totally. And from like a tactical perspective, I think you hit on the tools. I'd say for enablement pros that are listening in and like trying to figure out, okay, so how do I start to talk about enablement as that talent magnet and as that retention tool? That's where if you don't already have a relationship with your HR or people team, this is the time to do it, because you can align on key metrics around like the NPS surveys that they send out or the engagement surveys that they send out. A lot of the questions in there lead to like, do I feel like I've got the right tools and technology to do my job well? And so that's another area to measure success of your program if you partner with them early on and set up those structures together. There's also like leading indicators for that retention that the people team might have access to, like like referral rates, for example, right? Like a happy employee is going to refer other people to join. And so you've got another leading indicator around that retention side.
Love it. Those are excellent suggestions. Yeah, we're starting to partner very closely with our head of people on a lot of those different things as we think about culture and going back to the office and what changes need to stay that we implemented. And I'd love to hear from you, what were some of those changes that you guys made throughout the pandemic? And I know you joined slightly later in, but if you have any insight into like what are some of those changes in your approach or changes in delivering your training that you implemented like during the pandemic, which ones are there to stay, which ones are going? Like talk to us a little bit about that.
Yeah, first, can I just say it was really hard? Like, it was very, very hard for me personally, because I love creating engaging experiences. I find that, making learning, like a learning event, really memorable helps make the content memorable. And so, I think a rep even once called me, and I might date myself with this reference a little bit, like the Miss Frizzle of enablement, because I love a good theme party. I love setting off my like money gun in celebration of skill mastery. And I've even got like my pom-pom right here because we're going through pricing training this week. And so green for money, like you name it. But that was really hard for me to give up on like live events and make this transition. But I would also say like the enablement community is incredibly resilient. We always knew about this forgetting curve, right? We always knew about the forgetting curve and that you can mitigate it with additional reinforcement or mnemonic devices to make it more memorable. But I think the one that's crept up on us the most due to the pandemic is cognitive load awareness. And so understanding like what's all the distraction that's taking up the rep's time, how much are we throwing at them, and how can they consume that information in addition to the hundreds of other things they have to do on a day-to-day basis to keep their day job, right? So what I thought was really cool was the way that the enablement community rallied together to share best practices. Through the pandemic, we would host roundtables, especially for those that were facilitating their first all virtual sales kickoff, or we call it growth summit. But yeah, I think this was definitely some challenges that came into enablement.
Yeah, but I will say that, dark times always have a gift, and like there's always like a light at the end of the tunnel. At least that's how I try and go about life. And I think more than anything, those kinds of challenges force you to be so creative in your approach and to collaborate. Like you said, the amount of roundtables, and I'm in a few of those groups too. We led one with some of our customers. Like I think being able to share those best practices and hear teams just really bring those creative ideas on like, how do we keep people engaged? Do we break it up? Do we do longer sessions? Like, how do we think about the reinforcement afterwards? And to what you just mentioned, the cognitive load, that's something that I think about a lot. And I think is really important, both in how you design your learning, going back to the instructional design piece, like how do you actually format and design your learning for maximum retention? Because there are different formatting, in terms of extraneous and germane and different ways that your brain processes information that are more effective for retention, and also understanding that different employees, might be more visual learners versus might be more kinesthetic, et cetera. So I think all those things are really important, but going back to the distractions piece, I think that's an area where, frankly, from a product standpoint, we're super focused in terms of really thinking through like how can we support on that front. And that's something that we're always going back to, like how do we reverse engineer into how employees want to learn and what we know is scientifically effective versus looking at other platforms. But I think also something that I'm acutely aware of as a leader, right? I'm huge on being in flow state and the benefits that has on both your mental health and happiness as an employee, when it just feels like you have that, you're in that state of just like, you're doing what you're meant to be doing and you're focused and you're not getting distracted. And I think for me, the hardest part of being remote was all the Slack distractions and email distractions and then phone calls and then Zoom calls. And, I'm on 14 to 18 calls back to back a day. And by the end of the day, like I barely had time to talk to anyone else because I just felt like I was talking all day long. And so, when you're a sales rep and you're having to deal with all those same distractions and then you don't know where to find information and you attended a training, but the email didn't follow up afterwards with like the link to the resources you needed, all of that just adds to it. And I think it forced enablement teams to be much more process driven in the way that, hey, here's the kinds of tools or systems or enablement that we use to roll out this kind of change, whether it's more sales related versus or sales process related versus more system related. And so talk to me a little bit about, how do you guys think about like rolling out a small change? So pricing and packaging, it's kind of its own thing. There's a kumbaya, there's a lot going on there. When it comes to like a small change in one of your systems where you guys have a new outreach and sequence available, how do you guys, like what training tools or training methods have you designed to be most effective there?
Yeah, when it's a small change like that, we typically just try to hit them through a few different communication channels because like you said, like everyone's got a different preference on how they like to be approached for that information. The good thing now that we have Speckit is that, they can access it when they need it. And so while we've communicated to the team, I think this is really where, I've experienced a lot of challenges in the past with prioritizing some of those smaller process changes or even the bigger ones, right? Like, do you take the team off the floor if we're back in the office? Is it engaging enough? And so we really had to break down like what goes in person, what goes even virtually in person, and then what can we put through our technology? And for us, we found that if it's in person, it's really got to be the why behind it. We've got to be changing like the hearts and the minds and focused on mindset. We may show like a demo of the process, but it's going to be focused on what's in it for them. Because if you think about what we're going to measure afterwards, it's going to be like their motivation to apply it. But when we talk about actually giving them the process, I mean, depending on what it is, like when do you have a process change that's just 3 steps? Like it's very rare. And so when we think about retention of it, we need to be able to meet them where they're at. And so that's when we'll be able to chunk the information into the bite-sized portions that they'll need and put it in a way through Speckit that they're able to access it right when they need it.
Love to hear that. And I love the focus on why. And actually, this is something, so there's actually very little science on adoption. Like the only real scientific study I found is through University in Australia. And they analyze the factors that influence an individual's likelihood to adopt a new technology. And they found there's a number of different factors, but the first 3, with the first one being the most important, is what's in it for them. Like that was the number 1 piece. The second one was ease of use. And the third one was peer influence, going back to like having the, your champions and managers, et cetera. But the first one I think is so important because I think that's where people don't realize that. And that's influenced by like, if someone, for example, if we take a system like a Salesforce, if someone's used Salesforce in their past job, their history and that emotional relation that they have towards it might heavily impact their inclination to want to use it at their new job, right? And so understanding some of these questions is important, but that why is by far the most important factor that they found in terms of the resulting adoption, because once someone's bought into how it's gonna help them close more deals, right? Using outreach, you're gonna be able to get more pipeline, right? Once they're into the why, everything else comes easy. But if you haven't done a good job of really getting them excited, getting them engaged, and I think a lot of teams that I've seen that I speak to get wrong is they do that webinar rolling out a new change, and what they're showing is they're doing the demo, but that's like the 90% of it, when really the 90% of it should be the why, and the 10% should be, hey, here's what it is, and by the way, we're going to give the resource to you afterwards that you can follow. Because that is the piece that ultimately makes the whole difference between, and tying it to the leadership goals, tying it to the business goals that your CEO is talking about, that ultimately what's in it for them. How do you make more money? How do you get more pipeline? Whatever it is that you need to reverse engineer back into. And that's why sitting with your users, getting to know them, getting to understand like, okay, for this territory, they're really challenged with this. This is something that we can tie it back to that will make a big difference in how they feel emotionally attached to this change or whatever it is.
Totally. You've got to have that relationship so you can understand that motivation. And there's also variances in the motivation because people are motivated differently. But you're right. That's definitely an important step. I mean, even when I join a new company, one of the first things I do is sort of level set with leadership around like, what is their previous experience working with enablement? And sometimes it's none, and sometimes it's they had an awesome partnership and they have a very clear picture of what it looks like. And all of that's super important for me to know as a leader coming in and crafting a vision, because I need to be able to meet them where they're at. And a lot of times that means educating on what we do or course correcting if they have different expectations. That same philosophy translates to how we need to address our reps in our field around some of these changes that we're making as well.
Love it. Educating them on the why of enablement, which I think is half the battle of getting budget for new folks on your team, new tools, new systems, new processes, is getting leadership to really buy into. And going back to the lack of data, it is hard sometimes to measure the impact, right? So how do you articulate the value of the work that you're doing in order to get that buy-in, starting with the why? Love that. Now, let's step in a little bit to the futures, because I just took a look at the chat and there's a lot of different questions that I want to make sure that we address that came in specifically regarding the Kirkpatrick piece. Let's talk a little bit about the future of enablement. Like, if you close your eyes and envision the world of enablement 5 years from now, what does it look like?
I like that.
In your dream worlds.
Okay.
Let's go big.
Well, like, first I want to share a moment of appreciation for what the pandemic did do for us and thrusting us forward. So remember, I've worked in hypergrowth startups, and during these stages, I think companies are starting to open up a second or a third office, or started their international presence. And so I was already talking to my team about an intentionally distributed experience. This pandemic forced prioritization there, and it brought it to a boil where it was just a slow simmer in the past. And it's also improved a lot of skill sets in measuring engagement of virtual trainings, best practices for virtual facilitation. The other thing that I think is really cool that it's done for us is it helped to level the playing field. And what I mean by that is I remember when I would lead a training that would be this hybrid training, and you'd have a virtual candidate that would join, or a virtual candidate, a virtual participant that would join. And I just felt so bad. They had a poor experience when joining live sessions and being deprioritized. And so putting us all in this virtual environment has created this level set for us. And so it's starting to build that foundation that I can now envision this future that you're letting me do. So in dream state, I think we're going to leverage a lot more AI. I think we're going to experience a lot of the same trends that technology in general is experiencing. And what that will do is it'll surface content based on personalization. So content around maybe performance gaps that someone's experiencing, or maybe next role readiness. It recognizes that someone's been exceeding quota for a few quarters in a row. Let me start to feed them information that will actually prepare them for moving up segment. And so my company even has a product coming out soon that enables reps in real times on the call. And it just goes beyond conversational intelligence standards and puts enablement right in that quarterback, in the huddle, versus being that Monday coach reviewing game film by surfacing content real time. So I'm just so excited to see. I think it's going to be here sooner than we think when it comes to a 5-year timeline, just based on the rapid innovation that companies are having right now.
Yeah, the first piece you touched on is definitely what excites me as well. I mean, that's why we're integrated to systems, because I think, again, right now, what you've seen and what the product does today is being able to embed the training next to the relevant competitor, next to the relevant stage. Let's actually embed it where the user needs it. But again, by leveraging the data in Salesforce, we know, let's take Whitney as an AE for a hot sec. We know whether she's competed against that competitor before. We know whether she's made it to that stage before. We know whether she's gone to create a quote before. And if we're actually able to use that event data across Salesforce and any of our other systems, that can be leveraged to make it not just contextually just in time, but personalized just in time. And then going back to hitting quota, can we use aggregate data to do that? And then taking that a step further, going back to the impact piece, and this is ultimately that's the North Star. How can we leverage that to actually inform, hey, AEs who before their first compete call, take that battle card and quiz right there, right in time, right before they get on that call, see an increase in their win rate of 20% compared to those who don't, right? How can we start correlating the actual impact of that just-in-time timely training? Because it's not just, oh, they took it on week 1, so we can somehow correlate it to their deal week 6. It's if it's timely, if it's contextual, if it's just part of the way they work, we can start actually correlating the impact of training to the actual results and outcomes of the individual, as well as the business, as well as the enablement team. And to me, that is what excites me, is being able to like actually be able to say, hey, this content that we're spending time writing. And I saw something on LinkedIn actually just the other day. Someone was mentioning like with this move to more e-learning and more virtual based training, there's so much more writing of training than ever before. And so I think like there's gonna be some interesting talk about the future of enablement. I think, you know, as teams design their perfect enablement teams, you're gonna see certain roles that are really dedicated more towards like that content writing versus the delivery, et cetera. Because I think right now it's kind of this like hot potato that gets tossed around. Like no one really likes writing training, but it's a necessity, right? And that's why we have out-of-the-box content. And like my whole vision is like, you sign up for Spec, and whatever key app you use, you get out-of-the-box content that you can just customize. Because again, like how do you remove the burden of having to write content? But anyway, so I think there's gonna be some interesting team designs that get kind of formulated as a result of these shifts in enablement. And I think you're absolutely right. I think data is gonna be used to just take learning to a completely new level, where the idea of using a PowerPoint to deliver your training, even though, by the way, it's already kind of crazy given that it was invented in 1987, it's virtually not innovated since it moved to the cloud, is just gonna feel like using, you know, a Nokia brick phone from like the early 2000s instead of an iPhone. It's like, how, I mean, yes, can we communicate? But that's about it. Like, look at how much more we can do. And I think like this new wave of AI and data and personalization learning is gonna like make a huge impact on organizations and individuals entirely.
Well, and if you take those two concepts, right, like the data side and how it impacts the team structure, I mean, I remember watching Mary Shea, who's like a former analyst for Forrester. She did a presentation called The Future of Enablements in the C-Suite. And so this is what sets us up to be a strategic function, which I think is what's most exciting to me, to see like a long-term career path in the field that I love. And I hope that excites other people that are joining us today to learn more about it.
Yeah, I mean, if you've got chief customer officers that are 100% focused on employees, like, I mean, on your customers, like think about what that role looks like for employees, like strictly focused on like, how do we make sure that like next to our biggest competitor, our reps are 20% more efficient? Like you can't pay for that kind of competitive advantage as an organization. Like it's really, really huge. Anyway, well, this has been an awesome conversation, Whitney. Thank you so, so much. Before we leave, I want to make sure that we answer a few more of these questions that came in here. So give me a quick sec. I want to make sure that I'm going back here through the questions, or Elle, if you have one that you want to get us started. But I saw one earlier that said, you know, that specifically steps 3 and 4 of the Kirkpatrick model are really hard. And so someone asked if you could go into a little bit more detail around how you measure level 3.
Yeah, level 3 is a tough one. And so for us, we look at what do we have in order to measure the reinforcement strategy around it. So one of the first things that we do is we actually lay out a plan that's manager reinforcement. So what do managers need to know? What do they need to coach to? Depending on the topic, we'll create like scorecards that managers can leverage on when they're doing their call coaching to say that, you know, yes, it's aligning with the changes that we were expecting to make, or no, it's not. But also it's, instead of having that like drip campaign of information coming their way, how do we make sure that it just continues to surface when they need it, so that we can drive that change through to completion? And then like we make some assumptions around like when we should anticipate that adoption's there, and we check in along the way. But we also send out a behavior change survey to leaders to understand, like, are we seeing the changes that we anticipated? Like, we put these as our learning objectives in the beginning and they were related to behavior change. Have we seen that? And what is the impact of that is what we look for.
I love that. Surveys, which you just brought up, is, I think, very underutilized in the enablement field in general. That's actually something that we encourage like our customers to do. Like once they rolled out, it's just like and we're really more looking for sentiment analysis more than anything. It's just like, did it make your life easier? Did it make it easier for you to navigate things? And like, just like getting that feedback, because if it's not great, let's use that as constructive feedback around how we can make it. But I think, you know, using surveys and getting that feedback, and sometimes it might not be the best feedback, but it's always going to help, you know, improve things moving forward. And sorry, I keep looking over because I've got a little 6-month-old puppy that keeps trying to get into the conversation.
That's remote world we're in. But no, you're absolutely
there you go. We've got a live audience over here. Someone wants to see that.
Let's see. Oh my goodness. Cute.
His name's Rufus. He's 6 months old.
That is awesome.
He's a huge enablement enthusiast. Let me tell you guys over here.
Nice.
Just going back. Well, thank you. Turns out that was the highlight of the show. Great. We're done here. Bye. No, just kidding.
Yeah, and on the high note.
Couple more questions that I thought were really good here. So I saw here from Sarah. What advice do you have for a new person, and I assume in an enablement, who is feeling overwhelmed by the volume of onboarding that they need to do? Let's assume, and Sarah, if you want to add more details there, feel free to, but let's assume that they don't really have much of an onboarding program in place. Like, where would you recommend starting from an onboarding standpoint?
Yeah, if we're talking about like the stage in your enablement experience where you're building onboarding, I would say start with the end in mind. And so what I mean by that is like ask the right questions, involve the right people to understand what are those milestones that someone needs to achieve in order to become customer ready. And then with that milestone in mind, what resources do we have that maps to that to help get someone ready? And what do we need to build out to make sure that they do? The other part that I think is really important from an enablement perspective is aligning with sales leadership on criteria for success. If they all interpret what good looks like in a different way, your job is going to be so much harder. And I've learned that firsthand, right? By not doing that from the beginning. But that's why I'm saying start with the end in mind. What are they going to be coaching to in the end? Create a certification that aligns to that gold standard so that new hires aren't like going through this experience and right when they leave, their manager's like, I know they told you that, but you can do it this way. So those would be my words of advice for someone getting started there.
Love it. And I think if there's no onboarding program in place at all in terms of like what to start, a couple of things I'd recommend is like one, find like one of your top performing AEs and sit down with them and just be like, you know, if you had to tell a brand new person in your role, like just focus on mastering these three things about our product or about our sales process, what would those be? You'd be shocked to hear what they have to say. And like, you can try and like break it down in like very small, you know, just in terms of priority, like, hey, it sounds like competitive positioning is what's helped me be the most successful. Great, break that down. I'd also do the exact same exercise with someone who more recently joined, like in the last 6 months. It's like, hey, you've been here for 6 months. Looking back, like, what do you wish you would have learned sooner in the last 6 months that can help you? So again, if you've got nothing in place, to complement what Whitney said, you know, talk to at least two of those individuals in addition to leadership to get that real-time feedback. And then, you know, start small. I always say, like, when it comes to writing content, the old way of documentation was like these like long form Google Docs that went into, you know, narratives and books. One, no one likes to read them. No one likes to write them. So just start small. Like literally if you're thinking about like putting together competitive positioning, like put the competitive name and literally, and I can send you a template afterwards, Sarah, I'll make sure I get your email, but just put like, why do we win? Why do they win? What are 2 trap questions, right? With 3 bullet points each. It does not need to be extensive. Just like start small and build up and make sure you have a plan around it. And you'll see that by dedicating just, you know, a little bit of focus time, getting in that flow state and having just a little bit of a content outline, you'll be shocked by how far you make it. And you can always come back and revisit it, complement it, etc. But the hardest part is getting started and feeling like you've got this amount of training that you need to create. All of us have been in that pain. Start small. Hopefully that's helpful. Phil, how often do you find sales enablement objectives conflict with those of sales ops?
Ooh, that's a good one. I mean, I think that's why the partnership is so important, right? Like they should be aligned in a sense. And even with like some of those longer term initiatives, if I'm going to keep talking Kirkpatrick for a little bit, I think that, you know, there's a handoff at some point where, you know, levels 3 and 4, you're actually moving over to operations reporting on that in their regular meetings with the sales leaders versus enablement having to see it from start to finish because we're on to the next thing. So if you set up like something repeatable in the beginning, that partnership is crucial. But yeah, when there is a conflict, it can be a real challenge because you'll find that either you're rolling out a training that isn't ready to be operationalized or you're changing operations without being ready to enable the field. So stay really close with your ops partners.
I was actually just talking to a prospect this morning, and that was one of the challenges they outlined, which is, and they're a pretty big enterprise, and I think this happens more at large scale than at small scale, but basically their sales ops team is responsible for all the process and system changes that go out. So they're very familiar with how these are set up, but the enablement team is responsible for writing the content. And that handover between the two can be a challenge when it comes to like, well, who's responsible for creating the training and running the training when the enablement team isn't as savvy on the systems,
Right.
the sales team doesn't use the enablement tools. And so I think that relationship is super important. And also, again, going back to kind of the future of sales enablement, I think there's going to be specific roles that are really designed to act as that liaison for specifically, you know, systems and enablement junctures there. Cool. And then I saw one other question here. Can I ask for your thoughts on what touch point in the employee journey is you think is missed the most?
Ooh, yeah, that's a really good question. All right, well, it's easier to start with what we focus on the most. We focus on the most is onboarding and efficacy within the role. And then when we don't think as much until it's time to think about it around that internal mobility and retention side. And so that's where I think the conversation, Mel, that we were discussing around like get in with that partnership with HR so that you can look long-term will get you out of just like the hamster wheel motion of the typical deliverables and get you focused on long-term strategy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think for me that from a touch point standpoint, I think like, and I've said it multiple times throughout, like the number one thing I learned the most was sitting down with the individual users. Like if it's not on your calendar already, I think if you're an enablement professional, like every single week you should be spending at least 30 minutes of your time sitting down, not with just with leadership, but with a new SDR, an existing SDR, like switch it up, but spending time and really getting to hear firsthand from that employee, because what you'll learn is shocking. And more importantly, again, I manage Salesforce and like our systems too, but a lot of their pain points had such easily solvable solutions. They're like, oh, they want a button that they can, you know, download the report. Like, oh, they need training on how to add filters. Like a lot of the times, like what feels really scary or, you know, ineffective for the employee has very simple solutions. And so I think one of the best things that enablement folks can do is dedicate 30 minutes on your calendar to get coffee, get a virtual lunch. You'll get to know your team better, but you'll actually get to hear firsthand. And that feedback is invaluable when it comes to really designing an employee-centric enablement program.
And if you can't find the time for like that one-on-one conversation, then like, or if your company's at a certain scale, creating sort of like a revenue council where you've got those representation and you can leverage them for ideas, those will become your champions too. So love that approach.
100%. Awesome. Well, Whitney, we're at time here. Thank you so much. This was so much fun. I honestly think we could go on for more hours on this, and I saw a bunch of questions coming we didn't get to. So thank you all for attending too. Really appreciate it. You know, this is a topic that's near and dear to both of our hearts. So feel free to follow up to either of us on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on email. We'll share information afterwards, and always looking to do a little bit of brainstorming. Thanks so much. Have a great one. Thanks, Whitney. Bye-bye.
Bye, Mel.